So we move on to part 2, which is on thesis 2, ideology has a material existence. This is part of Althusser's move, ultimately a radical one, to explain ideology in terms of institutions rather than persons in their consciousness, or at least their ideas. So ideology has a material existence. This means, as he says, this is a brief quotation from page 21, an ideology always exists in an apparatus. An institution here means an ideological state apparatus. Any institution is an ideological state apparatus. An ideology always exists in an apparatus and in its practice or practices. This existence is material, he says. So, ideology isn't a set of thoughts primarily, it's in a set of practices. Go back to my example of teaching for a living. I don't do that except in relationship to an institution. It's not something that I just walk around doing every day. I do read and write and talk and listen every day, but I don't do it insofar as I'm teaching every day. I do it insofar as I'm doing all kinds of other things that I represent to myself ideologically, sure. But it's in as much as I am related to an institution and embedded in its practices that I do it as teaching. It's in relationship to the institution that I teach philosophy for a living, right? He has two very good examples: believing in God, duty, or justice. And the way he discusses ideology is in terms of the concept of belief. Ideology for him can be represented by belief. I believe that I teach philosophy for a living. One believes in God or in duty or justice in a similar kind of way. That may seem blasphemous to people who believe in God or in duty or justice, for that matter. But listen to this quotation from page 21. An individual who believes in God or justice or duty. This belief derives for everyone, for all those who live in an ideological representation of ideology, from the ideas of the individual concerned, that is, from him as a subject with a consciousness which contains the ideas of his belief. So that first quotation, for a person who has a belief in God or duty or justice, the first step in that belief comes from ideas that you have. There must be some connection to some ideological set of ideas that you have. I have to have some sense of what I'm doing. I have to have some sense in my mind about what God is or duty is. There must be some landing pad for ideology, for the practices of the institution to seat themselves in. But here's more about what belief means. The individual in question behaves in such and such a way, adopts such and such a practical attitude, and what is more, participates in certain regular practices, which are those of the ideological apparatus on which depend the ideas which he has in all consciousness freely chosen as a subject. That's a difficult sentence. It's on page 21. I'm going to repeat it. The individual in question, the person who believes, behaves in such and such a way, adopts such and such a practical attitude, and what is more, participates in certain regular practices, which are those of the ideological apparatus, on which depend the ideas, which he has in all consciousness freely chosen as a subject. Okay. I believe I teach philosophy for a living. I behave in a certain way. I adopt a certain practical attitude. I participate in certain regular practices of the institution, which is an ideological state apparatus, that depend on the ideas I have in my consciousness that I've chosen as a subject. Without my and my fellow faculty having freely decided to do this, the institution can't keep going. So there's an interdependence of the institution and my having adopted practices that are the institutions. There's no such thing as a church without people believing. And not just believing, but worshiping. And worshiping is more than believing, it's practicing. So, on page 22, he takes this a step further. Throughout the schema, says Althusser, we observe that the ideological representation of ideology is itself forced to recognize that every subject endowed with a consciousness and believing in the ideas that his consciousness inspires in him and freely accepts must act according to his ideas, must therefore inscribe his own ideas as a free subject in the actions of his material practice. If he does not do so, that is wicked. Let me relate this to someone that Althusser would be very upset with me relating him to, which is an American pragmatist philosopher. I'm not going to name names, who said that belief is the great guide of life. We never act contrary to our beliefs. We always act according to a belief. That's what a belief is. That's what it does. It's a practical guideline for our belief, for our actions, rather. So a belief that we don't act on isn't really a belief. It's inert. It's a non-belief. So a genuine belief, if such a thing has any meaning, is only a belief when it is acted on. Something like that is going on here. Only for Althusser, beliefs seem tied to institutions and their practices in a very special way, to the point that although they have a seat in the consciousness of the individual, they're as much dependent on the practices of the institution as they are on the consciousness of the individual. There does need to be a match, but there's an interdependency, codependency, one might say, between those two. He says further, this is also on page 22, his ideas, the ideas of the believer, are his material actions, inserted into material practices, governed by material rituals, which are themselves defined by the material ideological apparatus from which derive the ideas of that subject. The ideas of a believer are his material actions, inserted into material practices, governed by material rituals, which are themselves defined by the material ideological apparatus from which derive the ideas of that subject. In the sort of appendix, almost, as it were, to this essay where Althusser develops the example of the Christian ideology, it's rather opaque, unfortunately, because of the language and the elusive nature of it. But he develops, as part of that, a reference to Pascal's wager. If you're unfamiliar, Pascal's wager was developed by the philosopher Blaise Pascal. It was this. Pascal suggested that either there is or is not a God, if there is a God, and he doesn't believe in God, he, Pascal, does not believe in God, there'll be, pardon the expression, hell to pay when he dies. However, if there's not a God, and Pascal believes in God, there won't be any poor consequence of that. So, if there is no God and he believes in God, no bad consequence will happen. If there is a God and he doesn't believe in God, there will be a bad consequence. As a result, he says, he ought to believe in God. Because even if there isn't a God, he's still better off believing that there is. Althusser makes reference to this and sort of turns it on its head and suggests that rather than the cynical approach that Pascal has, the way he's examining the way Christian religion works, people in fact believe sincerely, but their belief is as much a matter of their performing the rituals as it is a matter of their sincerity in their hearts. In effect, kneel and say the prayers long enough, and the belief will become yours. Perform the material practices long enough, and believing in them will become your idea. Repeat the material actions, and your rituals, your life, will become governed by that. Because it's from the material ideological apparatus that the ideas of the subject derive. Where else could anyone get the idea of teaching but from schooling? There would be no teaching outside of that institution. There would be only reading and writing and speaking and listening. So, the really important takeaway of this is twofold. One, belief is material. Ideology is materially active. Ideology is a practice. Belief is a practice of what we do. Second, it's always tied to an institution. It's in relationship always to an institution, from which ultimately belief derives, and in connection to which ultimately belief is always practiced. You never believe anything on your own. If I had time, I would go into more about why that's so fascinating to me personally in relationship to the notion of authenticity of belief or genuineness of belief. It's almost as if he's taken the whole question of the sincerity of belief away. It doesn't matter. He criticizes Pascal's cynicism. But on the other end of the scale, the other end of the spectrum of belief, I think Althusser has removed the possibility of sincerity of belief too. That's really amazing to me. But we don't have time for that. Gotta move on. There's no time to waste. Gotta move on. Part 3 is ideology interpolates individuals as subjects. the difficulty with this, in my experience of teaching it, is the lingo. Althusser does explain what he means by subjects and explains by example what he means by interpolates, which turns out to be a coinage of his. Interpolates had a meaning in English before that referred primarily to parliamentary procedure, but not to much else. And I think it had a meaning referring to something related to insertion of letters into a word, that I think is a pretty obscure meaning of the word. But that notion of insertion, in parliamentary procedure, it meant interrupting the orders of the day. That interruption idea is part of where he's coming from. That may be useful. I think a very simple way of getting at it is by looking at one of his examples. He says that we're always already interpolated as subjects. Because, he says, before birth, you already were a you. You already were referred to. In fact, for many of the students that I teach, because of your ages, your biological sex was already known. So people were already referring to you with gender pronouns. That wasn't the case for me because I'm old enough that they didn't do that. But they already had a name picked out in the case that I turned out to be male. They didn't have one in the case that I turned out to be female. So, lucky for them. So they already refer to you, and by doing so, they interpolate. That is, they name you, they give you a subjectivity, they call you as a subject, that is, one who is a member of a society, a member of a group of persons who is going to be or is responsible, an agent of their own actions, someone who is going to be accountable for themselves, someone who's going to have a name, someone to whom attributes are going to be assigned, someone, for instance, to whom a gender is going to be ascribed. And in all those ways, interpolation is the beginning of that process for Althusser. The example for which he's famous is the "Hey you" of the policeman on the street. "Hey you" is a beautiful example because it could be directed towards anyone, and whoever turns around seems to be guilty. As he suggests, all of us are guilty of something, so "Hey you" interpolates all of us. It hails any single one of us. All of us are interpolated by the ideological state apparatuses in our society. One way or another, we're interpolated, all of us, as students. And then myself as a faculty member. We're all of us interpolated as citizens, somewhere or other. We're all of us interpolated as gendered. We're all of us interpolated as sexed, and so forth. Many of us resist one way or another, something that we will want to discuss further. But the interpolation is the beginning of how ideological state apparatuses lay claim to us as members, as believers, and as participants. So it is how we become included into ideology. And that's the main point in that section. So interpolation explains how it is that we became and become part of an institution, an ideological state apparatus. The school, the religion, politics, the United States of America, whatever level you want to talk about it on. I want to use the school because it's a handy example for all of us, or the university, or as I've liked to call it lately, California Ideological State Apparatus Stanislaus. The interpolation of us as members of that further draws us into the ideology and the ideological positions related to it, the practices of the institution, and along with those practices, the beliefs associated with those practices. And following along with those practices, belief in those practices, to the point of believing in the institutions themselves. At a certain point, we may find that we believe in such institutions as gender. With gender, for instance, we're hailed and interpolated into it before we have any chance to resist, most of us. Because most of us are raised to be gendered. If you liked this video, why? Here's what's happening right now as I interpret it. I put this video together to explain Althusser's theory of ideology. I'm uploading this video to YouTube. YouTube hails me as a producer of content when I upload the video. In fact, it beckons me to choose a catchy screen cap to try to garner more viewers, obviously so that YouTube will get more viewership, so that it will get more ad revenue, etc., etc. As a video uploader, the belief that I'm interpolated into as a subject producer of this quasi-mass medium called YouTube is that my video should try to reach a larger viewership. If my video is properly pitched, then it'll hail viewers. Hey you, my video should say. Right? You like kittens. Sorry, no kittens. So, you, the viewer, are hailed, right, as a viewer of YouTube videos who likes kitten videos, or in this case, who likes videos about ideology or Louis Althusser, or who is a student in my class. The more important issue is that you believe in YouTube. That is to say, you follow the institutional practices of YouTube viewers. You do what YouTube viewers do. You seek information or entertainment through YouTube. That's how it interpolates you, and how that interpolation has repercussions. It follows from that you adhere to its practices, and by adhering to its practices become a believer in those practices. Notice that the belief is a material, practical belief. So, related to the notion that the belief is in some capital S subject that he develops later on in the essay, YouTube might be the capital S subject. I'm not suggesting that you believe in the divinity of YouTube, but maybe you do. Perhaps it's by the providence of YouTube that you become entertained or informed about the right way to fold t-shirts, or how to unbox things, or about Althusser's concept of ideology.